It's beach time. Let's go play in the sea and the sand with Carolyn Dube's June 2016 Stencil Club stencil set.
Carolyn Dube here. What's the play for today? Well, it's this month's Stencil Club. I am honored to be able to reveal it because they invited me to be the designer this month. So thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you, John, for letting me be a part of Stencil Club. Well, this month's set, this collection, is inspired by my last trip to the ocean. Now, I love the blue water. I love the waves. There is just something magical to me about the ocean. And that's what I used to design this stencil. Now, you might notice the waves seem to be kind of similar between the top and the bottom. Yeah, that's because they work together. They're going to layer together to give you a lot of flexibility. You can use them separately or together. And am I going to show you how to do that? Absolutely. In the mini workshop inside Stencil Club, when the stencils are released, I'm going to have a video tutorial for you showing you how to layer these up. Now, what about the 6x6 and the 4x4? Well, those two came about because of the rain. We were lucky in that it only rained at night on our vacation, but in the morning, it left the most wonderful patterns in the sand. And each night, you'd think, oh, it's rain. It should be the same every morning if it's going to rain every night. But the size of the droplets, the kind of rain, how hard the rain was, made a difference in the patterns in the sand. I became absolutely fascinated by those sand patterns. Well, once I started looking at the sand there, I spent even more time looking at the sand throughout the day. And the patterns from the rain inspired the 6x6 as well as the 4x4. So I've got raindrops of various sizes, and I've got a pattern inspired by the sand on the ocean floor. Now, of course, you've got the exclusive video that's just in Stencil Club coming when the stencils are released on the 15th. But what about right now? I kind of couldn't wait. So this reveal video may run a little bit long, and I hope that the length of the video, that kind of thing, was more like a guideline from Stencil Girl, and that they don't mind if I run over sharing something with you, because I just got super excited about this, and I just have to share. I've also got a video showing you a different way to use it over on my blog today too, so head on over there and check it out once you finish this video. For this technique, I just want to use one row of the small raindrops. So I'm going to take some repositionable tape and I'm going to cover up the parts that I don't want to use. That makes it very, very easy for me to stencil these quickly without having to worry about being precise. Now that tape is kind of sticky sticking through the stencil, and how am I going to make it not so sticky? By pushing it on my sleeve. It's going to pick up some of the lint from my clothes, and that way it won't be sticky there or cause problems. The next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to take a needle, a pin, something. I'm actually using a sewing needle because it gives me a nice fine point and will do the job for me. And frankly, I have a bunch around and I don't really use them for sewing that often. What I'm going to do is actually poke a hole in the stencil. Yes, I am actually going to make another hole in the stencil, just a little one, and that pin is going to hold it in place so that my stencil will now turn, and I am going to build this sort of flower color burst kind of thing simply by using that pin in the middle and letting it spin. Now with this, things don't always line up exactly perfectly, so I am going to start on the back side where the flower is going to be kind of coming off the page. That way, that's the end of it where things lining up or not lining up won't show nearly as much. So now here comes the precision to line it up. I'm going to turn my stencil so that I can see just the edge of the first raindrop, and that way, so they're kind of just barely touching. And that's a cosmetic sponge that I'm using in some acrylic paint, and I'm just going to slide this over so it's barely touching the last raindrop, and then I'm going to stencil in my strip of raindrops here. And I'm just going to continue repeating this over and over again. Now, because I'm using a small amount of acrylic paint, there really isn't much of an issue with smearing. But you'll notice as I go to turn this, I do kind of gently lift up the stencil and then turn to prevent any extra smearing. So now you've got the gist of how this works and how I'm going to line this up so it looks like I spent all this time measuring or figuring out the radius and the circumference of the circle and how many of them will fit in it. No, I'm just putting them next to each other and then hiding at the very end where the spacing isn't quite as perfect. Now one color's nice, but let's bring in a second color. Pin is still in the same spot in the stencil, and I'm going to put it back in the exact same hole that was in the paper, and I'm going to line it up to start color number 2. I'm going to be putting this in between the first two, and it's really the second raindrop that I'm using because the two raindrops kind of touch on each side when I'm using the second one. And you can see in the first one, it's kind of got two parts of the other ones before it Boy, this is really hard to put into words. You can see what I'm doing. And so I'm just taking the cosmetic sponge and putting a second color on this. Now, in my excitement with this technique, I forgot to mention that I have basically a foam pad underneath, something that the pin can stick into. Now, some of you might be wondering how I could have the nerve, the audacity to poke a hole in the stencil. And well, my attitude is I'm all good with it, especially when it's not going to do any harm. Because here's the thing, it's just a little needle hole. And what I can do is if I don't want that needle hole to show up anytime I'm using the stencil and not in this way, is I just have a little piece of tape that I keep over it so that that hole is there when I want to use it and cover it up when I don't. And truth be told, there are several holes all over this stencil because I have had so much fun playing around with this technique. Now what you're seeing in this one is a very precise, a very orderly way of doing it. And that gives you one look. So as I finish up the last bit of this burst, here you can see what it looks like all complete. But what happens if you don't line things up so carefully? So I'm going to put another flower up here on the top part of the page. I've put the pin right near the edge of the paper, but not completely at the edge because I do need that pin to go through the paper to hold everything in place. And you can see I'm not lining anything up. I am just sort of going willy-nilly all over this thing. And I am just going to coat and cover this entire flower in these raindrops very, very willy-nilly. So I am just grabbing that cosmetic sponge. I'm not really thinking. My colors are blending together. I am just layering one on top of the other. The big trick to this, though, is that you'll notice that I'm lifting up the stencil when I move it because the paint there is a little bit damper. I'm getting a little more aggressive with the paint and using more paint because frankly, I'm just having a blast with it. And so if I have any kind of smearing or issue like that, what I can do is clean off the back of the stencil. I'm just going to take the pin out and then I'm going to take something like a paper towel, a baby wipe. If I'm going to use a baby wipe, I want to make sure that I do completely dry it when I'm done. I'm just going to clear any paint off of the back of it if I'm worried that there's any kind of smearing or that kind of stuff going on. There's the paper towel to make sure it's super dry because dry things have less paint run under them. The wetter things get, the more likely you are to have paint run underneath it. And then I'm back in business and my goal here is to kind of fill in a ton of that white space in this flower shape. As I'm going through, all I'm doing is really looking for where's there's a gap, where is there some white space and putting some color on it. Now, what happens if I put too much paint on like I just did there? Not a problem. I just wiped some of it off with the paper towel. On the other flower, you saw me being very careful and meticulous and lining things up. And on this one, it's the complete opposite. I am just slapping a bunch of these things down. I'm not really worrying about if everything's evenly spaced. My goal here is just to fill in all of the spaces. And it's going to give me a different look. And I still have just that same one hole in the stencil that I'm using to get both looks for this one. And what about that white gap right there where the pin was? Just a little bit of paint in the cosmetic sponge and it's all colored in. Well, what am I going to do with this? I'm going to show you how I turn this into an envelope. And by the way, here is what the card looks like using the raindrops in a more traditional raindrop way. And that's the video that I have over on the blog showing all the techniques and how I lined those up and got a precise look without having to do any hard work. Because you know me, I am not really going to measure anything if I don't have to. Well, it's not so much that I'm going to turn it into an envelope. I'm going to decorate one that I already have. And you might be recognizing that envelope with that do not bend on it, because that's the envelope that my stencils come in. So what I'm going to do is run this through the Xyron. And what that allows me to do is create a giant sticker. I highly recommend if you're using this that you don't have a bunch of wet paint over on the side that you're trying to be careful not to dump this into. Might be worth it kind of cleaning some space off. But basically I just trim it off and now I've turned this thing into one giant sticker. I'm going to peel the cover off of it, that top plastic, and what's left behind is this thing is instantly turned into a sticker. Now could I attach this in other ways? Absolutely. But for me, when I'm doing a large sheet of something, this is just the fastest, easiest way for me to get some adhesive on there and then stick it on. I do like using a dry adhesive when using a large piece of paper because it's less likely that things are going to wrinkle, buckle, that kind of thing. And so I am just putting it right over all the stuff that was already on that. So this envelope's ready for some addresses, ready to head out in the mail, heading on to somebody else. But I've got paint left on my palette. I've got a big blank space on the back, so I thought, you know what, I'm just going to play around and get a little bit of color and pattern on this. Now, this envelope has already found the center line for me thanks to the seam in it, and so I'm going to use that to my advantage. I am not going to work hard to line stuff up. I'm going to let that seam show me where to put the stencil, and I've done one side of it, and then I'm just going to flip the stencil over using that seam as my guide, so that gets me all the spacing, that hard measuring kind of part of it. Yeah, I don't really want a part of that. I'm going to use the stuff that's there to help me. And oh no, I just had some paint smeared there. I got some blue where I didn't want it. Is that going to be a problem? Absolutely not. It is an outstanding opportunity presenting suddenly. And you know what? There's more paint smearing around in places, so why not just smear even more so it looks like I meant to do that? Has that handmade kind of mixed media vibe if I'm going to get little bits of paint everywhere. And as long as I've got more paint out and there's plenty of white space on here, I'm going to put some raindrops going up that seam. And I'm going to use that seam again to help me line stuff up. I'm just going to go right in the point of the biggest raindrop. That way I know my raindrops are centered, and I'm just going to keep filling them up all the way. Now when I get up to the clear packing tape up there, paint does not stick as well to clear packing tape. Is that going to bother me? Absolutely not. So now I've got something happening on the back side of this. But I've still got more paint, so why not add some more stuff to this? Rather than just leaving these as big old raindrops, let's add a little more to them by outlining them. And while I was doing this, I started to realize I want a to and a from on the front of the envelope. But I'm not a big fan of my handwriting, so I am going to use a stencil to help me out with that. I'm just going to use the classic stencil font designed by Mary Beth Shaw to get that to and from on there, using up the paint that's already on my palette and the cosmetic sponges, and I am going to call this envelope ready to be addressed and sent out the door. Well, thanks so much for joining me for today's play. I hope when you receive your Stencil Club stencils that you enjoy these exclusive designs as much as I have enjoyed creating them and playing with them. And of course, I'll see you in the Stencil Club Facebook group. Looking forward to seeing all that you create with these. Thanks so much for letting me be a part of your colorful journey.
Thanks so much for watching. Remember, Stencil Club stencil sets ship on the 15th of the month, and members will be able to access the designer's exclusive project video and PDF. Need stencils? Just click the link below. Happy stenciling!